Hi, this video is about planning the best alternates. As ever, I will be focusing on non-commercial IFR in Europe, but quite a bit of what I talk about is applicable to VFR and elsewhere in the world. Let's talk first about why you nominate an alternate, both in your own mind and on the flight plan form. Firstly, it's a legal requirement for IFR flights, even non-commercial ones, except under some very strict conditions. Secondly, because there are a number of weather conditions such as cloud-based, RVR, wind, thunderstorms and freezing rain and drizzle, which might prevent you landing at your original destination. But also, the runway at your destination may be unusable because there's an incident on the runway, or even an incident elsewhere on or off the airport, which is fully occupying the fire crew or ATC, thus rendering the airport unavailable. Or there could be a system failure, such as ILS or approach or runway lighting, which make a landing impossible. Or the avionics system failure may be on the aircraft. If you lose your ILS and your destination doesn't have an RMP approach, or the other way around. ATC may be unavailable due to sickness, fatigue, fire in the tower or whatever. There may be a problem with the aircraft, such as engine issues, electrical power failure, fuel overconsumption or leakage, unforecast headwinds, meaning that you have to land earlier than planned in order to ensure minimum fuel reserve. You plan an alternate in your own mind to ensure that you're prepared, that you have the approach plates, have briefed yourself and checked that it's open and available and that customs, immigration, fuel and so on are all available. To some extent, it ensures that en route ATC is somewhat prepared for the diversion that you intend to make, though they will always be flexible. Generally speaking, in Europe, the alternate is not informed by you putting it on the flight plan, so this aspect is of relatively less importance. There's space on a flight plan to nominate two alternates, though you're only obliged to enter one, and it may be a good idea to have one en route and another beyond the destination, but there's no obligation to go to either in the case of a diversion. And do bear in mind that the ultimate alternate is not going at all. You can just decide that it's a no-go decision from the start. So, with all those different aspects of why you're planning an alternate, let's have a think about how you might determine the alternates you're going to nominate, both on the form and in your own mind, which may of course not be the same thing. For example, when going to Biggin Hill, I usually nominate Southend because it has an ILS to 200 feet, but my private plan is to go to Fair Oaks, which is 500 foot lower than Biggin and often available VFR when Biggin is below IFR minima, though it doesn't meet the legal minima for a nominated diversion. We have to start with the regulatory requirements. There's no point in nominating an alternate if it doesn't meet the minimum requirements demanded by regulation. Firstly, under IFR and Part NCO, you do not need to nominate an alternate if the weather is expected to be way above minima. This is defined as the destination having a standard instrument approach procedure available and the latest available meteorological information indicating that from an hour before till an hour after the estimated time of arrival, the cloud base will be at least 1,000 feet above the minimum associated with the instrument approach procedure, and the visibility will be at least 5,000 meters. But if the weather for the destination does not meet those criteria, then the alternate must be forecast to be similarly above weather minima for a period from an hour before until an hour after ETA. If the decision height is less than 250 feet, the cloud base must be at least 200 feet above the decision height or minimum descent height for the approach, and the visibility at least 1,500 meters. And if it's higher than 250 feet, then the ceiling must be at least 400 feet higher and the visibility at least 3,000 meters. If the proposed alternate does not have an instrument approach, then the ceiling must be the higher of 2,000 feet or the minimum safe IFR height and the visibility 5,000 meters. In addition to these rules, BIR holders obviously also need to adhere to minima based on their qualifications, which are actually the same for an alternate as for a destination. From an hour before until an hour after the ETA, at least 1,500 meters visibility, a cloud ceiling of at least 600 feet or circling minima if greater, and the decision height or MDH incremented by 200 feet. These are the EASA planning minima for the alternate aerodrome, applicable to EASA registered aircraft and to all aircraft operating in European airspace to ICAO standards. If you fly an N-registered aircraft, FAA rules additionally apply where they're more stringent than the EASA ones. Under the FAA 123 rule, no alternate is required at all if the destination is forecast to have at least a 2,000-foot ceiling and 4,800 meters visibility for the period of 1 hour before to 1 hour after your ETA. If those conditions are not met and an alternate is required, the alternate itself must be forecast at your ETA to have at least a 600-foot ceiling and 3,200 meters visibility, precision approach, ILS or LPV, or 800-foot ceiling and 3,200 meters visibility, it has only a non-precision approach. Notice that the FAA bases its rules on the airport elevation, while EASA is based on the decision height or MDH, so, annoyingly, you have to do both calculations, as either could be more stringent than the other for a particular approach. If the airport publishes specific alternate minima on its approach chart, those values take precedence over the standard figures. Let's have a quick look at the rules governing tempo and prob in the two regimes, bearing in mind that I'm only talking about Part NCO and Part 91, non-commercial operation. Firstly, a tempo or a prob that indicates an improvement cannot be taken into account in either jurisdiction. EASA allows you to discount tempo or prob tempo deterioration below alternate minima, providing it refers to transient phenomena such as showery conditions as opposed to reduced visibility or continuous rain, in which case it must be taken into account. But the FAA say that a tempo below alternate minima completely disqualifies the airport as an alternate. A Prop 30 or Prop 40 can be ignored for showers under both EASA and FAA rules, but under EASA rules, again, only if it applies to showers as opposed to persistent conditions. Having said that, you need to think about the airmanship of nominating an alternate with slightly dodgy weather. If I'm carrying those I love, I really want a Cav OK alternate, or at least one that's unconditionally way above minima. But for the moment, I've told you the rules. The regulations also stipulate minimum fuel requirements. We must have fuel for taxi, takeoff, en route, missed approach at destination, climb, en route cruise to the alternate, descent, and execution of the approach and landing, and then to land with 45 minutes final reserve in a piston aircraft or 30 minutes in a turbine. Under Part NCO, contingency fuel is at our discretion, but again, to keep our families safe and our names out of the newspapers, it's sensible to add one, maybe 5% of cruise fuel. There used to be a requirement that one of the destination or alternate has a non-RMP approach which is above minima. This is no longer the case in Part NCO. Both can now be RMP, provided one of them has minima above LNAV minima, in case of SBAS failure. However, again, just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. You should consider GNSS failure and ILS failure and think about there being an alternative. VOR is not a substitute for ILS. NDB is only a substitute if you have a working ADF, as GNSS substitution is not permitted on the final approach. So, enough on the regulations. Let's think about your choice of alternate once you've met the regulatory requirements. Something which is often suggested, but not so often applied in my experience, is that your alternate should be closer to your point of departure than your destination. There's a bit of a mindset that an alternate is only used once you've made an approach at the destination, possibly more than one approach, and then decide to divert. However, for a variety of reasons, the decision to divert is often made before you get to destination. One important reason is that, on the whole, if the destination weather is deteriorating, it's because the bad weather is coming towards you. If the bad weather were travelling in the same direction as you, or even across your path, then the chances are you would have chosen not to depart. Therefore, anything beyond the destination is likely to be even worse than the destination itself. The other reasons for picking an alternate before the destination are less weather-related. Firstly, you may have technical issues en route, such as engine problems, electrical problems, or even just gauges which don't feel quite right. You may also find that you're burning more fuel than you expected, which may be because of worse than forecast headwinds, or possibly even a fuel leak or an error in refueling. You may even have a passenger who's sick or has a weak bladder. Of course, if you decide that you need to divert en route, ATC will always help with the information about what's open and what emergency facilities they have. However, they almost certainly won't be able to investigate whether they have fuel available or customs and immigration. And then there are operational reasons. You'll be landing at your alternate with more fuel than if you had nominated an alternate beyond your destination. This gives you more flexibility and puts you under less pressure. You'll be less fatigued and acting more calmly if you take an early decision to divert rather than going through the stress of possible multiple approaches and then having to think about a diversion. Part of that rethinking will be to have to do with terrain. If you plan the alternate before the destination, the terrain will be better known to you because it's on your original route, rather than being between your destination and an alternate further afield. Some other weather considerations you'll want to take into account, regardless of whether the alternate is before or after the destination, are that the TAF for the alternate should be better than that for the destination and certainly not worse. If possible, you should be aiming for a different microclimate to the destination. There are loads of examples of how the microclimate may be different. If the destination is coastal, you should probably think about the alternate being inland or even on an opposite facing coast. If the destination is one side of a range of hills, you might think it's sensible to look for an alternate on the other side. If the destination is on an island, it's probably not a great idea to have your alternate on a different nearby island, the most obvious examples being Guernsey and Jersey, but there are plenty of others. And so the list goes on. But the biggest thing about climate is it makes no sense for the alternate to be close by the destination and at the same elevation, unless the instrument approach at the alternate has much lower minima. Indeed, it's a good idea to try and think of an alternate which is lower than the destination so as to increase the cloud base. And finally, it's a good idea to look for an alternate which has a runway in a distinctly different direction from the destination in case the problem is with crosswind. That may be as a result of there being more than one runway available, or it may be that the single runway points in a different direction. Runways, we know to our cost, do not always face the prevailing wind. Obviously, not all of these considerations are going to apply to every trip. For example, there's no point in worrying about runway direction if there's an area of slack pressure around the destination, and so on. It may seem too obvious to say, but do have a careful look at NOTAMs for the alternate as well as destination. The airport may be closed, limited to VFR operations, or may not have fuel available. Consequently, checking the NOTAMs becomes an important element of deciding your alternate. Another consideration, which may be too obvious to mention, is that having an alternate with a longer runway, lower decision altitude or MDA, full ATC, full fire service and so on, is a major consideration. And finally, let's mention some practical considerations. These are the ones most often forgotten. It's so easy simply to look for a nearby IFR airport and nominate it as your alternate, as you're encouraged to do by some planning systems such as Autorouter. But you may miss a whole bunch of things which, when you think about them, are painfully obvious. A really good example of this is that one of the closest IFR alternates to Le Touquet is Lydd, and vice versa, but there are 100 different reasons why they make terrible alternates to each other. Hours of operation. No, really, I've seen people nominate airports which are closed, for example, at the weekend. What's the point of that? But it's not just a question of whether the airport and ATC are available. At some places, IFR approaches are limited to when a qualified controller is on duty. Fuel is often not available for the full opening hours of the airport. In fact, you need to check that they have avgas if that's what you require. Customs and immigration, if required, may only be available at limited times. Indeed, if customs and immigration are required, and yet there is a notice period, as is very often the case in France, which is, let's face it, the most likely place to want immigration as it's closest to the Schengen border, will they accept you on a diversion? Will they hold you there for the 48-hour notice period? It's definitely worth a phone call. If you have a genuine emergency, the border controls are not applied, but you must have declared Mayday or Pan-Pan. It's worth noting that there are a couple of airfields on the Channel coast which have full-time customs, namely Le Touquet and Ostend, making them particularly good alternates, as even if you don't meet the required custom notification timescale, you have the knowledge that there will be officers present, which is all that really matters. If you're coming to the UK and can't get into the destination where you've told Border Force you'll be arriving, there's an emergency number which you can call from wherever you land. It may be that they make you wait there for several hours while they send officers out to meet you. So again, it's a good idea to make your alternate one where customs are available full-time. Biggin Hill and Southend, therefore, become good alternates on the other side of the Channel. Finally, let's think about some mundane but important aspects of alternate selection. Once you get to the alternate, you're going to want to do one of three things. Get to your original destination, because that's where your business meeting or relatives are, or where you've promised your children a particular activity. Stay there and wait it out. Or choose a different activity, such as a different beach or sightseeing. In the first case, you need to think carefully about ground transport options, such as car hire, access to main roads, and access to railway stations which serve your original destination. Please bear in mind, when you get to your alternate, that by definition the weather is poor and you're tired and stressed, and you should think very carefully about whether you're now fit for a many-hour drive to your original destination. If you're just going to sit it out, then you need to know there's a hotel and restaurant accessible to the airport. You don't want a long drive to the nearest town there and back. If you decide to go to a different resort, you need to make sure there's something suitable at your chosen alternate. Okay, that's all I can think of, but if you have other thoughts and suggestions, please put them in the comments. See you in the next video.